classic encounter story. This strange case in Villa Santina, Italy, has been known about for decades. What many have heard is that while an artist, Luigi Rapuzzi, was painting a mountain landscape, a red disc flew down right in front of him. Two creatures then exited the bizarre object before using some type of advanced technology to paralyze him. They then took his painting before entering their craft and flying away. But is this exactly how everything happened? Looking further into this case, we come to find that one mistranslated word has changed our view of the story for many years. Let's talk about how events actually went down that day. This event all started in mid-1947 to a man named Luigi Rapuzzi. He was staying in a small village called Raviaro near Villa Santina in Carnia. He would often stay there during the summers and had actually become quite well known in the area. Luigi Rapuzzi, later known as L.R. Johannes, was a professional painter, an author, a college professor, and even an amateur geologist and anthropologist. He would spend most of his leisure time studying his interest, and he went out to this small village to search the nearby mountains for fossils. On the morning of August 14th, like most days, Luigi was making his way up the valley of Mountain Col Gentile, following a stream called the Chiarso. These are the Carnic and Venetian Alps, which are located in the northernmost part of Italy. He had his geologist pick in a hand and a knapsack on his back containing his lunch and tools. The stream was almost dry this time of year, and it made for a good path which avoided thickets of fir trees and large deposits of rubble and other debris. As he was walking, he was looking at the side of a cliff face which he noted had many different types of weathered rocks and multiple layers of gypsum. He continued just a little further where he entered a clearing in the trees. This is when he would spot a very large, vivid red, circular object embedded vertically into the cliff above him about 150 feet away. He quickly put on his glasses and walked closer to the strange object. Now he could tell that this was some sort of short disc that looked to be made of a varnished metal. Looking closer, Luigi was able to see what he thought was a shiny telescopic antenna on the very top, commenting that the way it protruded reminded him of a car antenna. He wasn't able to make out any more details, saying that it had no other apertures. The disc was at least 30 feet wide, but he couldn't tell exactly how tall it was. To him, it looked like about a fourth of the thing was embedded in a large cleft in the cliff face. He was as close as he could get at this point, with the red object about 20 feet above him. Deciding that he still needed to investigate further, he thought about climbing up the cliff. But he also knew that this would be dangerous, so he first looked around the area to see if anybody else was out there to help him if he ended up needing it. Within just a few moments, he thought he saw a couple of boys emerging from a grove of trees. He shouted at them and pointed to the bizarre object. When they didn't react, he started to move towards them. When he got about 60 feet away from them, he could tell something was off, and soon became petrified. Luigi said, "The two boys were dwarves, the likes of which I had never seen nor even imagined. They were coming towards me slowly, with tiny strides, and their hands at their sides and their head motionless." The two creatures then stopped just a few steps in front of him, only staring at him for several moments. Luigi was in such a state of shock at this time that he felt that he was dreaming and had no strength left in his body at all. He would later say that it was a dominating mixture of enormous astonishment combined with fear. But even so, his mind was active, observing every detail he could see. The two strange beings looked to be identical, with neither one of them over 3 feet tall. They both wore a dark blue colored coverall, looking to be made of a possibly plastic-like material that was almost translucent. The suits also had fairly large belts and collars around each opening, which were all of vivid red color. Their heads appeared to be larger than a normal person's, and they didn't seem to have any hair at all. Instead, on the top of their heads, they had some sort of dark brown tight-fitting cap, which made him think of an alpinist bonnet, or what we might call now a beanie. Their skin was almost an earthly green color, and to him it resembled a plasticine or maybe clay dipped in water appearance. The nose was very straight and long, so much so that it looked, in his words, geometrically cut. However, below that, the mouth only appeared as a small slit in the shape of a circumflex accent. The mouth would also open and close at regular intervals, and to him it resembled a fish's mouth. The eyes were huge in comparison to a normal person's, and they also looked to be protruded halfway out of the head. They were a yellow-green color and had long vertical pupils. Luigi continued, saying, "I saw no traces of eyebrows or eyelashes, and what I could have called eyelids consisted of a ring, midway between green and yellow. which surrounded the base of those hemispherical eyes just like the frame of a pair of spectacles. He stood there in astonishment for what felt like a very long time, with him and the two creatures staring back at one another. At one point, he raised his pick in the air and started waving it towards the large red disc. In a somewhat agitated voice, he shouted at them, asking who they were, where they came from, and if he could be any help to them. They then turned very quickly, with one of the creatures reaching towards the center of its belt. Out of the center, a thin puff of smoke, or maybe a type of ray, would emerge and shoot right towards him. He couldn't remember if he had said anything else to them at this point, as things started to happen very quickly. Before Luigi could even react to this, he felt his body go limp. He said, "Before I had time to move or do anything, I found myself laid out full length on the ground. My pick shot out of my hand, as though snatched by an invisible force." Thinking back on it, Luigi believes that he may have seemed like a threat to these two, after he raised his pick and shouted towards them. He would also say that he had only ever been electrocuted once in his life, 20 years ago back in college, and the sensation he felt on his body right now, after the smoke ray came in contact with him, was very similar. As Luigi laid there, the two short humanoids began to approach him, stopping just 6 feet away from where his pick was laying. He managed to turn just enough to see one of them bend down and pick the tool up, which looked to actually be taller than the creature itself. This is when he first noticed their bizarre green hands. Each one had 8 fingers, with 4 all opposable to the other 4. They might have even been some type of claws, as he didn't think the fingers were completely jointed. He also noticed that the chest of these creatures were almost quivering, reminding him of a panting dog. The two then turned around and started to walk back towards this large disc. Luigi tried as hard as he could to get back up, and eventually made it into a sort of sitting position, with his arms propping him up so he wouldn't fall back over. By this point, the two entities were beneath the cliff, and slowly but surely the two started to climb up the cleft. They went right into the crevice the disc was embedded in and disappeared, assumably into the object itself. He sat and watched for several more minutes before the disc suddenly shot straight out of the rock, rising into the air. Then, just 30 feet away from him, it stopped and remained stationary. A shower of rocks and earth then poured off the cliff, landing on the ground below. Once the rocks had settled, all he could hear was the nearby trickling stream. The disc didn't seem to be making any sound. He would say that it almost looked like an enormous, suspended gong floating in the sky, adding, "And for a moment, I was seized with terror that it was going to come down and cut me in half like a worm." He shouted at the very top of his lungs and made every effort he could to escape. However, he still wasn't able to stay standing, and ended up falling over onto the rocks several times, getting himself quite beaten up. The flying disc began to tilt slightly, before starting to grow smaller and smaller before vanishing completely. As soon as it was gone, a blast of air rushed over him, sending him rolling while also blinding him with all the airborne dust. He ended up against some stones in the riverbed, where he laid and tried to recover his strength. After some time, he was able to sit back up, looking down at his watch to see that it was now 9:14 a.m. Luigi now realized that the entire encounter had only lasted a few minutes altogether. At this point, he still didn't feel great either, saying that he almost thought he had broken a few bones. He also added that his legs felt so weak that he compared it to drinking way too much. He took a nap for about an hour and then woke up and decided to eat his lunch. This is when he made an odd discovery. First, he found that his coffee had spilled all over everything, his playing cards, his maps, his sketches of the area, but this actually didn't surprise him. What did was the fact that his metal thermos was nowhere to be found. Luigi also couldn't find his fork for his food or the aluminum canister that held his lunch. His food was actually still there too, but it was all covered in coffee. He ate his coffee-soaked bread, but then threw everything else out. Feeling a bit better, he started to search the area for his pick, but unfortunately, he never would find it. Luigi said, "I searched in vain for my pick, which would have been very useful to me at this point as a walking stick." He made his way back down the mountains, making it back to the village around 2 p.m. He immediately went back to the inn he was staying at, wanting to go back to bed. On his way inside, the owner of the inn, who he had known for about 30 years, noticed his beaten-up appearance and asked him what had happened. Not quite ready to share his true experience, Luigi only told her they had fallen from the top of a rock. In response, she told him that it served him right, and that it was high time for him to stop going around and picking up stones. Laughing it off, he soon went to his room and fell asleep. The next morning, he woke up fairly early and decided that he needed to go back out to that spot. He grabbed another pick, and this time a revolver, and made his way back up the mountain where he had made his strange encounter. He searched the area, but unfortunately didn't find anything. Deciding to look at where the craft had been, he climbed up the cleft in the cliff just as the two entities had. He looked around, but never found a trace of anything there either. He commented on this, saying, "I thought the two creatures might have thrown my old pick in there, to which I was very much attached to, but I found nothing." At this point, he was trying to explain the experience any way he could. First, he thought it could have been a secret aircraft from the Allies or from the Russians developed during the war. He soon dismissed this and thought that maybe it was the craft of some uncontacted human civilization. But he soon dismissed that theory as well, just neither scenario would explain the two creatures he had seen. At the time, he didn't even consider that it could have been a flying saucer from extraterrestrial origin, as he had never heard of them before and had never seen them in any Italian media. Luigi then decided to do what many people still do today: say absolutely nothing and never tell a soul about what happened to him. And he did just that for quite some time, saying, "I had no wish to be considered a crazy visionary or worse." During this time, he had actually been part of the resistance movement during World War II and had been arrested 2 different times for opposing those in power. Just 2 months after his encounter, he would leave Italy, sailing for the USA. It was on this journey that he first heard of Kenneth Arnold's encounter. He was a pilot who many say made the first widely reported UFO sighting in modern times. Arnold claimed to have seen 9 dish-shaped objects traveling in a line at fantastic speed, almost looking like saucers skimming over water. After reading about this, Luigi came to the conclusion that he must have also seen the same thing, a flying saucer. He quickly became a fan of UFO encounter stories and began to read many different books about them once he was in the States. After about 3 years in the States, in 1950, he finally had enough confidence to tell a couple of different journalists about his encounter, but he would ask them not to publish his story until he was ready. Luigi then became caught up in his work, putting his story to the side as he restored and created paintings all over Manhattan. Then, in 1951, it was discovered that he had actually moved to the US illegally and he would soon be forced to move back to Italy. Before being deported, he had learned of an encounter published in El Europeo involving 2 dead little men. Thinking that now may be the time to tell his encounter, he sent a letter to this publisher, asking them to print his story as well. Now he actually felt getting his story out there was his #1 priority. 2 months later, he would be sent back to Italy, without ever hearing back from El Europeo. Once there, Luigi decided just to call the director himself. But unfortunately, they wouldn't publish his encounters, telling them that they needed some kind of proof to authenticate the whole thing. Replying to this, Luigi said, "If on that morning in August 1947 I had imagined I was going to encounter creatures from another world, I would certainly not have hesitated for one moment to take along with me a whole troop of journalists, cinematographers, and why not a company of soldiers too." Not willing to give up just yet, he went back out to Villa Santina the very next day. He started to make inquiries and actually found a couple of people that claimed to have seen strange flying objects just one day before he had. First, an older man told him that at 8:30 in the morning that day, he had been sitting in the village square enjoying the sunshine. Out of nowhere, a red globe looking to be carried on the wind flew up the mountain nearest to the town. Next, a younger boy and his mother would tell of how at 10 a.m. that day, while working in the fields, they saw a red ball rising up into the sky. It flew at great speeds before vanishing completely. Although these 2 testimonies were definitely interesting to Luigi, he didn't really feel like the publishers would think the same way. So this is where he decided to move on with his life and, for the most part, put his encounter behind him. However, he still did keep up on his readings. He closely followed stories of flying saucers and was actually quite disgusted about how people looked at the subject. Eventually, his disgust turned into more of a bitterness. Luigi just didn't like how such an important subject could be treated this way. He eventually turned to writing and began to make some of his first science fiction novels using the pen name L.R. Johannes. One of Luigi's good friends was a man named Giorgio Monticelli, the historian responsible for Urania, the largest science fiction series in Italy at the time. Given him a chance, he published Luigi's story called Once Upon a Time There Was a Planet in April 1954 in the 41st issue. The next year in December, his story called When I Was an Aboriginal would be published in the 110th issue. Both of these books were set in the same fictional world where survivors from a more advanced planet came to Earth after it blew up and created the asteroid belt. They then came to Earth and mated with more primitive man, mixing their genes together and therefore creating modern man. He would soon change his pseudonym once again, now writing by the pen name N.H. Laurentix. He would have one more story in Urania printed under this name, in the 1956 128th issue called Cosmic Renaissance. The same year he would make his own magazine called Galaxia. It only had 5 issues, but he did all of the cover art himself, and even had one of his own stories in the 5th issue called The Jules Revolt. His last writing, called Moon Operation, would be in a magazine called Cosmo Fantasticnazia, back in 1958. After this, he seems to have put writing on the side and focused more on his artwork. From 1959 to 1963, Luigi held several personal and private art galleries all around Italy, and even in the nearby countries. Then in 1964, Luigi's story was finally published in the May edition of Cleopis by one of the men he had spoken to back in New York, named Charles Bowen. Then soon after this, in a book called Humanoid by the same author, and this printing even had a sketch of the humanoids he had drawn just 2 months after it all happened. Luigi would keep in contact with Bowen too, explaining that how now he thought the aliens might have been some sort of robots. He also added, "I believe that old pick of mine is now in a museum on some other planet. I hope that somebody up there is trying to decipher the marks cut in the handle. My name and a mountaineering motto, and a pair of stylized alpine flowers, and an eagle. And I hope they rack their brains to a standstill trying to make it out." At the end of Luigi's segment in Humanoid, Bowen adds some information from other encounters that he feels may be relevant. First, he mentions that in 1952, an Italian engineer, Gian Pietro Monguzzi, had actually taken pictures of a very similar craft. Although the pictures were and are still highly disputed, the object seen in them almost exactly fits Luigi's description of a short disc with a metallic-like antenna sticking out of the top. These photos were taken only 100 miles away from Villa Santina and occurred about 9 a.m. in the morning, the same time of day as Luigi's encounter. Bowen also mentions how in 1965, 12 different reports of little creatures were also made in South America, and 9 of these reports came from mountainous regions, and all of them had claims of 3-foot-tall creatures being seen. He also mentions the Cisco Grove case and how the robot Donald Trump encountered had similar knockout gas abilities. In his book, he suggested that even though Luigi may not have perceived it, he must have been knocked out completely at some point, because at some time the 2 creatures had taken his metal items. Bowen wonders if some extraterrestrial agency is using these biological-appearing robots as a way to study our planet. After all of this, Luigi kept a low profile for several years, before sadly passing away from cancer in 1968. However, this wasn't quite the end of his story. In 1974, the second man he had spoke to back in New York, Antonio Ribera, wrote of him in his book of encounters called El Gran Enigma, and although this was probably more popular than Charles Bowen's Humanoid, it actually contained one major mistake. When reading the story for himself, Bowen would discover Antonio had mistranslated pick and somehow switched it to easel. This gave the impression that Luigi was waving around his paintbrushes at the strange creatures, which obviously isn't quite as threatening. No one questioned this either, since Luigi was a fairly famous painter. Even today, this story is often repeated in this falsely translated way, and many believers think this is how the encounter actually went down. But even so, the Villa Santina case is one of the earliest and most detailed accounts of a close encounter with an extraterrestrial being in the entirety of Europe. Many researchers say that the large amounts of detail come from Luigi's experience with painting, and that he gave a description that only an artist would be able to convey. And although not many people believed him at this time, nowadays the amount of reports of similar objects gives much more credit to Luigi's experience. At the time, it was true that Italian media didn't even cover UFO-related material, yet he perfectly described an object we are so used to seeing today. A large disc with a metallic finish with the ability to hover, rise, fly, and even disappear. So although we may never know the true intent these creatures had, we do know that Luigi was not the first, and definitely not the last, to have a frightening encounter like this. Thanks again for watching, everyone. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you like this type of content, and be sure to leave a comment too. I'm always interested to hear what you guys think about these cases, and I always need some more topics to cover. If you want to know more about the Cisco Grove case and Donald Trump's encounter with robots and aliens, be sure to check out my video on that as well. And this is still tier 3 of the alien iceberg I've slowly been going through. I'm just trying to be sure to get every bit of detail in there as I can. And if anybody is interested in hearing this in audio form, it is available on most podcast platforms. For anyone wanting to show your support, I do have a Patreon and a channel membership up where you can get videos early and ad-free, so please be sure to check those out. This was Matt, and I want to believe.